Imagine being so good that one of rock's wildest drummers ever, Keith Moon, hears you play and says, nope, that's unplayable. Not bad, not slow, just beyond reach. These aren't amateurs. These are legendary drummers that Moon himself respected and still couldn't believe what they were doing. Keith Moon wasn't just a drummer. He was a storm. A beautiful, reckless, barely controlled explosion behind the kit. He didn't play to the song. He played against it, under it, over it, sometimes all at once. But even he had his limits. And there were a few drummers who pushed those limits into the impossible. 1. Buddy Rich, the speed demon. Let's start with a name even Moon wouldn't joke about. Buddy Rich. Moon once called Buddy Rich a bloody machine. Not with admiration, with a kind of terrified awe. Rich wasn't just fast. He was clean, precise, and impossible to distract. Moon, who thrived on chaos, admitted, I can't even count what he's playing. There's a famous story. Moon was once backstage watching Rich do a solo with one stick. Just one. And the crowd was going mad. Keith turned to a roadie and said, that's unplayable. He's not human. What made Rich unplayable to Moon wasn't just technique. It was discipline. Moon couldn't be that precise if his life depended on it. Rich could hit 1,000 strokes in a minute and still have time to light a cigarette. Moon's chaos was power. Rich's control was intimidating. And Keith knew the difference. 2. Ginger Baker, the Dark Wizard. Moon and Ginger Baker were often compared, but Moon hated that. Not because he thought Ginger was worse, but because Ginger Baker could do things Moon simply refused to try. Baker was the kind of drummer who'd mix jazz with African rhythms, swing with brutal power, and do it all while looking like he was ready to fight the world. Moon once said, Ginger's drumming is like black magic. I don't understand it, and I don't want to. To Moon, Baker was a technician and a sorcerer. 1 minute, he'd be doing straight rock fills. The next, he'd slip into 11/8 time like it was nothing. Keith didn't do time signatures. He did vibes. So when Baker went off into rhythmic space, Moon watched from the ground and said, I'm not following him there. Moon respected Baker, even feared him a bit. He called him a menace with sticks. And behind the scenes, he once told a journalist, if I tried to copy Ginger, I'd probably lose my mind. 3. Elvin Jones, the jazz hurricane. Most rock drummers avoided jazz legends. Not Keith. He watched them, studied them, and when he saw Elvin Jones playing with John Coltrane, he knew he was witnessing something he couldn't replicate. Jones was intensity personified. He used polyrhythms like weapons. He played with emotion that wasn't just felt, it was spiritual. Keith tried jamming to a Coltrane record once and stopped 30 seconds in. That's not drumming, he said. That's some kind of ritual. Elvin could hit the ride, the snare, the floor tom, and the hi-hat all in different rhythms, and still land on the one. For Moon, that was impossible. His own style wasn't about mathematical accuracy. It was about energy, explosion, eruption. Moon never bad-mouthed Elvin Jones. In fact, he rarely even talked about him. But when he did, it was short. That's unplayable. End of. Here's what's wild. Keith Moon knew he wasn't the most technical drummer. He didn't care about time signatures or grip or rudiments. He cared about feel, about performance, about drama. But when he saw players who mastered both the emotional and the technical, that's when he dropped his bravado. There's a backstage quote from 1971. Moon watched a fusion band warming up. Afterward, he walked off and said, you can have all the drums in the world, but you'll never outplay a ghost. No one knew exactly who he meant, but people guess he was talking about Elvin, or maybe all three. So by now, we've seen Keith Moon's respect for the greats of jazz and fusion. But in Chapter 2, it gets even more personal, because next, we'll look at two drummers who were not just legends, but friends. And Moon still called them unplayable. It's one thing to admire a legend from afar, but it's something else entirely when the guy you call unplayable is standing next to you watching you perform. Keith Moon didn't just idolize some of these drummers. He shared stages, toured, and partied with them. And even in those wild, hazy moments, Moon never pretended he could keep up. Here are two drummers Keith Moon knew personally and still couldn't wrap his head around. 4. Mitch Mitchell, the ghost in the machine. Mitch Mitchell was the engine behind Jimi Hendrix. He played like a jazz drummer trapped in a psychedelic rock circus. He could ride a beat like he was surfing across waves, then crash into a fill so smooth you barely noticed the transition. Keith Moon respected that deeply. In fact, Moon and Mitchell were often seen together at London clubs. But when it came to drumming, Moon once said, "Mitch plays inside out. I play upside down." It wasn't a joke. It was his honest take. One night, after watching Hendrix and Mitchell tear through fire, Moon reportedly turned to Pete Townshend and whispered, "If I tried that kind of control, I'd explode. He's got technique I don't even know how to pronounce." The thing with Mitchell wasn't just speed or timing, it was musicality. Mitch could listen to Hendrix twist a solo into another dimension, and instead of just keeping time, he'd dance around the guitar. He was like a second soloist. Moon loved chaos, but Mitchell's chaos had structure. That made him unplayable in Keith's eyes. He wasn't just drumming, he was painting with sound. And yet, the two remained close friends. In fact, Mitchell once said Moon had more pure instinct than any drummer he'd met. But instinct couldn't always match intellect. And Moon knew it. 5. Carl Palmer, the prog machine. If Mitch Mitchell was fluid, then Carl Palmer was carved from granite. Precision, complexity, power. One of the founding members of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Palmer made progressive rock look easy. But behind the scenes, his routines were brutal. Moon once sat in on a sound check with Palmer and said, "I thought it was a spaceship taking off. I kept waiting for something to go wrong, and it didn't. That's not normal." Palmer used double kick drums long before they were cool. He'd write solos with 5 distinct movements, like miniature symphonies. He knew music theory. He knew notation. He could write his solos out like sheet music. Moon could barely keep time if there wasn't a live crowd screaming. But what made Palmer unplayable to Moon wasn't just the technical wizardry. It was the discipline. Carl trained like a classical musician. He'd spend hours working on a single passage. Moon once said, "If I had to practice that much, I'd set the kit on fire." That wasn't a dig. That was Keith's way of saying, "This guy lives in another world." Still, there was admiration buried in the jokes. Moon admitted in an interview that Palmer's playing made him feel like a hooligan at a ballet. When you're Keith Moon and you say someone's drumming is too much to handle, that's saying a lot. This is what's fascinating. Keith Moon wasn't trying to compete. He wasn't trying to one-up guys like Mitchell or Palmer. He was playing a completely different game. Where Mitchell floated, Moon thundered. Where Palmer calculated, Moon improvised. Moon was the guy who threw television sets out of windows and filled hotel bathtubs with explosives. Palmer was the guy who did rudiments in 13/8. So when Moon called these drummers unplayable, he wasn't trashing them. He was acknowledging a truth every great musician eventually realizes. There are some talents so different from your own, you just tip your hat and step aside. And make no mistake, Mitchell and Palmer tipped their hats right back. Mitchell once said, "Moon couldn't read music, but he could read a room. His playing told stories." Palmer said, "Keith broke every rule and made new ones in the process." In a way, Keith Moon needed these drummers. They kept him grounded. They reminded him that music was bigger than madness. That technique mattered. That structure had power. But they also made him laugh. They reminded him not to take himself too seriously. Because no matter how unplayable they were, Keith Moon was still Keith Moon. And no one could do what he did either. By now, you've seen Keith Moon show humility. You've seen him praise jazz titans and call his own friends unplayable. But there was one drummer, one single name, who didn't just intimidate Moon. He broke him. Not physically, not in a fight, but in spirit. This drummer was so complex, so far removed from anything Moon could understand, that he once told a reporter, "If I tried to play like that, I'd break both my arms and all my furniture." This is the story of the one drummer Keith Moon couldn't joke about. 6. Billy Cobham, the alien behind the kit. Billy Cobham was a monster. Not in size, not in attitude, but in sound. When Moon heard Cobham for the first time, it wasn't even live. It was on a record, Mahavishnu Orchestra's Inner Mounting Flame. A friend handed it to him and said, "You think you've heard everything. Play track 1. The next day, Moon returned the vinyl, wide-eyed and pale. "Unplayable," he said. "That's not a drummer. That's an alien." Cobham's technique wasn't just fast. It was inhuman. He played with both hands open-handed, meaning he didn't cross over on the hi-hat like most right-handed drummers. That gave him access to more drums, more quickly. His fills weren't just fast. They were fluid and violent, and still perfectly in time. But here's what really scared Moon. Cobham made complexity sound effortless. He was blazing through 1916 time signatures while smiling, like it was just another day at the office. Moon once said, "Billy's playing makes me feel like I've been banging pots and pans with spoons." That's how wide the gap felt. Moon didn't fear many things. But with Cobham, it wasn't about fear. It was about perspective. Cobham exposed something Keith had never faced head-on, the mathematics of drumming. Cobham was the kind of player who wrote charts for his parts, who studied snare dynamics like they were physics problems, who could solo in 7/4 while comping melodies on the toms. Moon didn't write music. He didn't analyze his rhythms. He felt everything. And when he heard Cobham, he realized there were entire worlds of rhythm he'd never even visited, maybe couldn't. In a 1975 interview, Keith said, "There's guys like Billy who are gods in labs. I'm just a maniac in a garage." He wasn't bitter. He was being honest. Billy Cobham, whether he knew it or not, had shown Moon a version of drumming that felt like it came from another planet. It wasn't better. It wasn't worse. But it was miles from where Keith lived. And Moon didn't even try to fake understanding it. Now, here's where the story flips. When we hear that Keith Moon called someone unplayable, it's easy to think he meant they were better than him. But that's not the whole truth. Moon called himself unplayable sometimes. Not because he was being modest, but because he genuinely believed that what he did behind the kit was just as strange and alien as what someone like Cobham did. He once told John Entwistle, "You can't teach what I do. I don't even know what I'm doing half the time." And he was right. Moon didn't follow rules. He didn't count measures. He didn't even use a hi-hat pedal most of the time. He just went for it, in full force, like his life depended on it. So when he called Cobham, or Elvin Jones, or Carl Palmer unplayable, it wasn't always an insult to himself. Sometimes it was just a recognition. We are speaking different languages, and I don't have the dictionary. And the best part, many of the drummers Moon admired him right back. Cobham once said in an interview, "Keith Moon didn't play drums. He played energy. You don't teach that. You feel that." Even someone as mechanical and precise as Carl Palmer admitted, "There's only one Keith Moon. You can try to play his parts note for note, but it'll never feel the same." And that was the key. Keith Moon didn't want to be Elvin Jones. He didn't want to be Billy Cobham. He didn't even want to be consistent. He wanted to explode behind the drums, and that's exactly what he did. He could admit other drummers were unplayable, but no one could replace him, because no one else would play like that. Not ever. So what does it mean when one of rock's most iconic drummers calls someone unplayable? It means they've crossed into a different level, one so unique or so advanced that even Keith Moon, the mad genius of The Who, had to pause and say, "That's beyond me." And that takes courage to admit. Moon wasn't afraid to name his limits. In doing so, he carved out his own legacy, not just as a wild man with sticks, but as someone who respected the art of drumming, even if it didn't always show. Buddy Rich, Ginger Baker, Elvin Jones, Mitch Mitchell, Carl Palmer, Billy Cobham. 6 names, 6 masters, 6 unplayables. But there's a 7th name that's missing. One more that they would have called unplayable. Keith Moon. The drummer who broke all the rules because he never learned them in the first place.